Chapter 4. The Myth of the Free Market. The Loss of Diversity, Democracy, and Economic Resiliency. Begins with a quote from Maya Angelou. It is time for parents to teach young people that in diversity there is beauty and there is strength. Self-organization. As they grow, all biological systems increase their complexity, their parts becoming ever more specialized and tightly integrated. As each part does what it needs to do to sustain itself, it creates conditions that sustain the whole. As a result, the entire system increases its efficient use of material and energy resources, with every byproduct becoming a useful resource for some other biological entity. Self-organization is the key to sustainability of all biological systems, as it creates resiliency and stability. Coevolution and specialization. In January of 1998, I had the opportunity to lead a coral reef ecology trip to the Florida Keys. Coral reefs were an entirely new ecosystem for me and demanded a good amount of research before the trip on the various species of fish, corals, and other invertebrates that we would encounter. I also had to become a certified diver. My daughter Kelsey, who was 17 at the time, got her certification along with me, and we became diving buddies. I will never forget our first dive within those glorious corridors of coral. The variety of forms and colors of corals and fish was astounding. Even more compelling was how all those species managed to coexist. Each species of fish was specialized to inhabit a particular part of the reef and had evolved a specific means of foraging to avoid direct competition with other species for food. These species occupied small, specialized niches. In this case, a niche isn't a physical place, such as a small cavity in the coral, but rather an ecological concept that is defined as a species' ecological role. A species niche involves the totality of its interactions with both the biotic and abiotic components of its ecosystem. It even includes all of a species' behaviors and adaptations. The niche is so all-encompassing that it would be impossible to define it for any organism. So rather than trying to describe a species niche, ecologists focus on its subsets, like the foraging niche. We are also interested in the dynamics of how niches change, whether they get more expansive or shrink. Through time, most species niches grow smaller as organisms become more specialized. This change is driven by coevolution, a process by which species adapt to each other. Outside our kitchen window, we have a bird feeder that consistently attracts two species of birds whose niches overlap quite a bit: the black-capped chickadee and the white-breasted nuthatch. Their niches overlap because they live in the same forest, and when they don't have access to a bird feeder, they glean insects off the same trees. They even look similar, with white breasts, gray backs, and black crowns. To reduce direct competition for food, they have specialized in the parts of the tree where they feed, decreasing the size of their foraging niche. Nuthatches forage on the trunks of the trees, while chickadees work the branches. As a result, they have developed different beak, foot, and wing morphologies. Nuthatches have a very long back toe and claw, which allows them to walk, quote-unquote, down a tree's trunk. By lifting the back claw, they drop a short distance only to stop their descent when they lower the claw to catch the bark. Their much longer beak gives them the ability to probe bark fissures that chickadees can't access. The chickadee has smaller, rounded wings that allow for short bursts of hovering flight at the ends of branches, where its small beak gleans insects from twigs and leaves. Through these co-evolved specializations, chickadees and nuthatches have reduced their competition for food so they can coexist more successfully. Competition in nature is quite a bit different than it is in human endeavors. In the natural world, species don't seek competition, and more important, no winners emerge from its struggles. Although an individual or a species may prevail from a competitive interaction, they lose energy during the competition, more energy than if the competitive interactions had never occurred. So even those who prevail can't be considered winners. It is such energy losses that cause species to move away from competition through time, through the coevolution of specializations that reduce the nature of the competition, such as dividing the foraging areas on a tree, or being active at different times, such as hawks during the day and owls at night. This type of reduction of competition can even happen among plant species. During April, long before the leaves have broken bud, an excursion into a calcium-enriched northeastern woodland will repay any visitor with a feast for the eyes. The ground will be carpeted with the solid, verdant emerald green of the ephemeral vernal wildflowers, wild leeks, trout lily, spring beauties, Dutchman's breeches, squirrel corn. All these plants sprout early in the spring and do all their photosynthesis before the canopy leaves burst forth in early May. The ephemeral then die back and are replaced by a whole new group of plants, including blue cohosh, maidenhair fern, baneberry, plantain-leaved sedge, and many others. Because of the timing of the wildflowers and ferns' photosynthesis, these forests hosts more species of understory plants than any other in the region, giving them a high level of self-organization. Like competition, predation also gives rise to co-evolved specialized traits. As predators begin to focus on certain species, their prey develop specialized adaptations to avoid being caught. Both are specializations that reduce the size of the species' niches. Summer mornings while having coffee, Marcia and I are captivated by the behaviors of two species, a predator and its prey, whose co-evolved interactions take place just under the porch roof. Barn spiders live underneath the shady roof overhang. These are large, hairy, gray spiders that make big orb-shaped webs, often more than 2 feet in diameter. Every morning before sunrise, as the dark of night is drawn away, the barn spiders meticulously remake their webs, damaged from nighttime captures. Yet as soon as the sun comes up, they retreat into tight nooks where the roof overhang meets the porch wall. There they remain still, in hiding from mud dauber wasps. The wasps are seeking spiders as food for their young. Any unwary barn spider will find itself being stung, anesthetized, carried away, and eventually encased in a segmented tube of hardened mud. Once the spider is placed in the mud cell, the wasp lays a single egg on it. Upon hatching, the wasp larva eats the sleeping spider alive. Both the spider and the wasp have become quite specialized in this predatory interaction. The wasp seeks out only large webs in search of spiders and has developed sophisticated behaviors to trick spiders into exposing themselves, such as feigning being caught in a web. For their part, barn spiders have adapted to being active mostly at night, when they focus on moths as prey, and to remain hidden and still during the day. The niche of both species has grown smaller, owing to these specialized, co-evolved traits brought about by their predator-prey interaction. But predation and competition are not the only kinds of interactions that generate smaller niches. The coevolution of positive interactions between species also results in specialization, the most striking example being mutualism. Mutualism is a relationship between two species of organism in which both benefit from interaction, and the coexistence is essential for the survival of one, or more commonly, both species. The highly co-evolved mutualism of the bull's horn acacia tree and a species of acacia ant, studied by tropical ecologist Daniel Jensen in eastern Mexico, offers a good example. The acacia tree has developed a number of morphological characteristics to support resident acacia ants. The tree has large spongy thorns, the reason for its name, that can be hollowed out by the ants as nesting sites. To provide food for the ants, the acacia tree has evolved balation bodies, small protein-rich extensions on the leaf margins that can be harvested by the ants without damaging the acacia's leaves. The tree also has open sap wells on the leaf stem where the ants can access sugary sap as both an energy resource and water supply. Ants removed from the acacia tree starve to death because Belton bodies and acacia sap are all they will consume. In return, the ants vigorously protect the acacia tree they live in from all leaf-consuming animals. Whether it is a small insect or a large herbivore such as a cow, all unwanted animals are driven away by the potent stings of acacia ants. Not only that, the ants also cut down any vines that attempt to grow on the acacia tree, and they defoliate branches of surrounding trees that start to invade the acacia's space. In this way, the ants offer a super defense system for the acacia. When the ants are removed from an acacia tree, it eventually succumbs to herbivores and surrounding competitors. In this example, both ants and acacia have grown so specialized that their very existence is dependent on their mutualistic partner. This may seem like a chancy proposition, for if one goes extinct, the other will quickly follow. But coevolution isn't based on future probabilities. It is driven by the need for energy efficiency. Mutualism is such an energy-saving strategy that a large number of species have put all their evolutionary eggs in this basket. In nature, energy is the bottom-line currency, and unlike human currencies, it is rock solid. A kilocalorie of energy always remains the same fundamental unit. Since energy is a finite resource in ecosystems, natural selection always favors individuals or populations that develop energy-efficient adaptations or behaviors and selects out individuals or populations that are energy wasteful. Coevolution is always pushing species to become more energy efficient. When two species first begin to interact, the nature of their relationship is often very negative for both parties. One reason ecologists stress that we should not move species from one part of the world to another. A dramatic example can be found in the accidental introduction of the chestnut blight fungus into North America in 1904. The fungus was present in oriental chestnut trees planted in the Bronx Zoo and Botanical Garden. The oriental chestnuts looked fine because they had co-evolved with the fungus for tens of thousands, if maybe millions of years. However, the American chestnut had no such relationship with the fungus. At the time the fungus arrived, the American chestnut was the most common forest tree east of the Mississippi River. In the heart of the species range, forests of Tennessee and Kentucky, 1 out of every 2 trees was an American chestnut. Within 30 years of the introduction of the fungus, the American chestnut was almost completely wiped out. This was obviously a highly negative outcome for the chestnut. Less widely considered is the fact that this was not good for the fungus either. If an organism is a parasite, the worst thing it can do is kill off its host species. That would be an incredible, energy wasteful, and lethal outcome. If 2 species survive their initial encounters, natural selection will force them to interact in less energy-wasteful, harmful ways. Over long periods of time, relationships that began disastrously, like that between the American chestnut and the chestnut blight fungus, can eventually develop into a mutualism where both species not only benefit, but also need one another to survive, as is the case between the bullhorn's acacia and its resident acacia ant. What is fascinating about the mutualism of the acacia and its ants is that ants are derived from leaf-cutter ants. When these tropical ants first encountered the ancestral acacia trees, they probably defoliated and killed them. That was very energy wasteful, so natural selection forced the ants and acacia to adjust their ecologies. The eventual result is witnessed in the tight mutualism they exhibit today. Coevolution is responsible for 2 important outcomes in ecosystems beyond reducing the size of species niches: energy efficiency and species that provide important services to each other. Together, these allow for the development of highly integrated, stable communities. As species become more specialized, their efficient use of energy increases. This allows more species to exist in an ecosystem as the finite amount of energy is divided into smaller shares. There's also no waste in the ecosystem. Every byproduct released by one species is a critical resource for another. Through decomposition, pollination, dispersal of seeds, and a myriad of other services species provide within an ecosystem, they are all inextricably tied to one another's well-being. While working to sustain themselves, all species co-evolve to support each other. Ecosystems offer a wonderful view of complex, sustainable systems. Species richness and complexity. Through evolutionary time, measured in tens of thousands to millions of years, coevolution decreases the size of niches and allows more species to prosper. This has resulted in ever-increasing species richness, often called biodiversity. In The Diversity of Life, E.O. Wilson describes 5 major extinction events that have taken place in the biosphere during the last 500 million years. Each of these events, brought on by dramatic changes in the global environment, extinguished a large percentage of species that existed at that time. Yet in each case, within 10 to 20 million years, the biosphere not only recovered its original level of biodiversity of species, but exceeded it. Coevolution is such a potent process that it has produced the conservatively estimated 10 to 20 million species that presently inhabit the Earth. The biosphere has consistently increased its diversity and, as a result, its complexity through time. Increasing complexity is inherent in all natural systems that grow. In Chapter 2, I used the growth of our bodies as an example of an anti-entropic, complex system. During our development, we witnessed one cell growing into more than 30 trillion cells. Not only that, during that period of growth, that one cell differentiated into 254 different kinds of cells: skin, muscle, nerve, bone, blood cells, just to name a few. Within each type of cell, there is even further specialization. Some nerve cells only communicate with muscle cells, others only receive messages from sensory cells, and others act as bridges between nerve cells. These specialized cells regulate themselves but also work collectively to support each other, just as species in an ecosystem do. This is another example of how complexity or self-organization increases through time, something that occurs within all multicellular organisms as they grow and differentiate. We can also witness the same thing occurring in an ecosystem as it matures successionally. As a forest or coral reef develops following some form of disturbance, such as a hurricane, its species richness, biodiversity, increases. In a forest, much of this richness is hidden, since we have a tendency to focus on large, easily visible species such as trees, wildflowers, birds, and mammals. But in the soil and the canopy of the forest, bacteria, fungi, and invertebrates dramatically increase their numbers through time. All of the natural systems we see around us become more complex, efficient, and integrated as they grow. Factors that foster species richness. Not all ecosystems share the same levels of biodiversity. Tropical rainforests and coral reef ecosystems have much greater levels of species richness than most deserts or the Arctic tundra. To explain why some ecosystems host many species and others relatively few, let us look at the factors that determine the level of species richness and self-organization in ecosystems. One important factor that fosters species richness is a stable physical environment, such as you would find in a climate that does not change dramatically through the year. Imagine that you are going on 2 separate year-long field expeditions, one to Hawaii and one to Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. Think about the clothing you would need to pack for each trip. For Hawaii, a few pair of shorts, t-shirts, a sun hat, sunglasses, a rain jacket, a bathing suit, and a pair of sandals would be adequate, as the climate is so consistent. But for your trip to Baffin Island, you would need extreme cold weather clothing for the winter and a wide variety of clothing for the highly variable weather of summer. While a single carry-on bag would do for your trip to Hawaii, you would need trunks filled with clothing for a trip to Baffin Island. In this analogy, the amount of clothing is equivalent to a species' adaptations and the size of its niche. In physically stable environments such as Hawaii's, niches can be small since species don't need to have a wide variety of adaptations to cope with environmental change. They can also successfully exist in smaller populations, as the potential for extinction through a single dramatic weather event is very low. Since niches and population sizes are smaller in stable physical environments, more species can coexist there than in unstable physical environments that demand large niches and populations. The amount of physical structure in an ecosystem is another critical factor. While Kelsey and I were diving in the Florida Keys, we at times encountered sections where corals didn't exist. These sites appeared as expansive floors of sand devoid of anything else. In these areas, the diversity of reef organisms such as fish plummeted. Here, species richness was directly related to the amount of physical structure present in the ecosystem. Where there were corals, the structure of the reef ecosystem was complex, allowing species of fish to specialize. The reef as a whole was the habitat of the fish that lived there, but within it, species of fish specialized to inhabit specific parts of the reef, their microhabitat. Many species of fish sorted themselves at different vertical heights within the reef. Others specialized to coexist with specific species of coral. However, in the sandy flats, few microhabitats were available because there was little structural diversity, and as a result, few species of fish were seen. A third important factor that fosters species richness in an ecosystem is reduced levels of competition. Excessive competition by one species can force out other species in a dynamic termed competitive exclusion. There are two major ways that competitive species can be kept in check: through keystone predators and intermediate levels of disturbance. A fine example of a keystone predator enhancing species richness comes from research conducted by Robert Payne in the tidal pools of Washington State. Payne noted that these tide pools normally contain 15 species of mollusks and barnacles, including the Californian mussel, whose major predator is the ochre sea star. Payne wanted to observe what would happen to the mollusk-barnacle community if sea stars were excluded from tide pools, so he handpicked starfish from selected pools while allowing others to harbor starfish as experimental controls. Through this treatment, the species richness of mollusks and barnacles in the pools without starfish dropped from 15 to 8, close to a 50% decrease. At the same time, the population of mussels exploded. Without predation by starfish, the mussels population was not kept in check, and it excluded 7 other species by outcompeting them for space within the tide pool. In this example, the starfish is the keystone predator. When removed, the species richness of the tide pool crumbled, just as removing the central keystone from an arch will cause it to collapse. Intermediate levels of disturbance also maintain high levels of species richness. However, too much or too little disturbance can extinguish species. A favorite hike of mine is along the northern section of the Franconia Ridge in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. This is a narrow alpine ridgetop, roughly 30 feet wide and a few miles in length. A 3-foot wide path snakes along the ridgeline. When I was in college in the late 1960s, on either side of this path one could find healthy communities of alpine plants: dwarf bilberry, diapensia, Bigelow's sedge. Many of these individual plants were centuries old and stood no more than a few inches in height. They existed on the ridge because they could handle the toughest weather in New England, where winter winds greater than 100 miles an hour regularly ice-blasted all the other species out of existence. Yet these hardy plants can't tolerate being trampled. Through the past 3 decades, as hiker traffic dramatically increased on this ridge, more and more people wandered off-trail to take in the precipitous views. Today, on the ridgetop, where lush alpine vegetation once existed, one finds only exposed beds of brown gravel. Too much foot traffic created excessive levels of disturbance and a dramatic reduction in species richness in sections of the ridgetop ecosystem. Too little disturbance can also reduce species richness. To the west of my home is Rocky Ridge. This is a rugged ridgeline with small sections of old-growth forests dominated by eastern hemlock. Today, the major disturbances on Rocky Ridge are occasional loggings in less rugged parts of the ridge and blowdowns. Hypothetically, if we could put a dome over Rocky Ridge and exclude all forms of disturbance like logging and wind, its species richness would in time dramatically decrease through competitive exclusion created by the hemlock. Hemlock is the most competitive tree in this part of New England. It creates very deep shade and a dense acidic needle layer on the forest floor in which few other species can successfully grow. Without disturbance to keep their numbers in check, the hemlocks on Rocky Ridge would soon extinguish most other species. Thus, intermediate levels of disturbance are not too great to extinguish species and keep competitive exclusion from occurring. And then he's got in different type, into the forest. At first sight, the Pisgah old-growth doesn't appear to have a high level of species richness. I can see only 5 species of dominant canopy trees: hemlock, white pine, beech, black birch, and red oak. Species of understory shrubs are even fewer, including mountain laurel, witch hazel, and maple leaf viburnum. Due to the dense shade of the hemlocks, ferns and other herbaceous plants are uncommon. But this view of the forest's diversity is skewed, what one of my colleagues calls above-ground bias. Within this soil and the decaying hulks of downed trees, the diversity of species has become enormous. The summer of 2003 was one of the wettest witnessed in central New England. During September of that year, I had visited the old growth, and what I saw then was completely different from what I saw on a hot July afternoon several years later. That September, the understory of this forest was transformed into a fairy tale land of fungi. Huge colonies of golden chanterelles covered the ground. Ammonites of various hues sported enormous warty-topped toadstools. Varieties of coral fungi added many textures and colors to the mix. Numerous species of polyphores and puffballs festooned the decaying trunks of downed trees. I counted over 40 species of fungi growing out of the soil and decaying wood. 2 were completely new species that I had never seen before, including a light green gilled mushroom. Many of the species I saw were saprophytes, such as the numerous species of puffballs, meaning that they get their energy from decomposing wood or other organic material in the soils. There were also many mycorrhizal species, such as the ammonites. The relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and trees offers another example of mutualism. The fungus gets its energy from the roots of trees while allowing trees to dramatically increase their rates of nutrient uptake. This is such a critical interaction that many conifer species of trees can't exist without their mycorrhizae. Part of the mycorrhizae's function is to more quickly decompose organic litter and transfer the released nutrients directly to the tree roots. In this way, mycorrhizae help not only the trees with which they are associated, but the entire forest system by recycling nutrients that might otherwise leach out of the soil and be lost from the old-growth forest. That this forest is able to sustain itself is in large part due to the mycorrhizae and other decomposers in the soil. In front of me was the rotting trunk of a 1 foot in diameter beech. It was covered in charcoal mat fungus, making it look as if it had been burned, when in reality it was just in advanced stages of decay. I rolled part of the trunk back and found 2 species of salamanders, the robust yellow-spotted salamander and the delicate red-backed salamander, and a whole host of scurrying beetles. All the downed wood in this forest adds greatly to its species richness. Like the reef, the decaying wood creates microhabitats for salamanders, beetles, and many other organisms that we can't even see. The dead beech was a critical resource for these species, which in turn would recycle the beech's nutrients to support new generations of beech, like the smooth-trunked tree to my right. This beech had a unique pattern on its bark. I saw a series of light tracks about 1/4 of an inch wide that ran all over the bark, intersecting in a grand web. These were the foraging trails of the slugs that graze on the algae that grow on the beech bark. In this way, the slugs are not unlike periwinkles that graze on algae in intertidal rocks. In this forest, mycorrhizae fungi supported a beech that in turn supported the algae that sustained slugs. When the beech dies, it will sustain a whole new community of species. This is just an infinitesimal part of the interlocking web of interactions that make and sustain this old-growth forest. If any species became dominant enough to exclude many others, for example, if one species of fungus outcompeted all the others, the forest would be simplified. Specifically, the forest would lose repetition within its mycorrhizae services, making the whole more fragile. This simplified forest would be less able to resist perturbations that would jeopardize its sustainability if one species of fungus were extinguished. Certainly, it would be far less efficient in its use of energy and would have a greatly reduced capacity to recycle its nutrients. For this forest, as Maya Angelou has said more generally, its strength is in its diversity. As a final example of self-organization in an ecosystem, I would like you to imagine a summer meadow full of wildflowers. If we inventoried all the pollinators in that meadow through the course of the season, we'd find hundreds of different species, including bees and wasps, hornets, flies, beetles, ants, moths, and butterflies. Each species is specialized to be active at a different time of the summer and to pollinate flowers in subtly different ways. If any species of pollinator should go extinct, the meadow would be fine, for the other pollinators would fill the gap in service. Coevolution, by forcing ever greater specialization, makes species niches smaller, which in turn boosts species richness, creating a high level of repetition with respect to pollination. It is exactly this repetition which occurs in all functional roles within an ecosystem, from those played by numerous species of photosynthetic plants to untold numbers of decomposers, that gives ecosystems their resiliency and stability, because the extinction of one species does not threaten the integrity of the whole system. Corporate mergers, competitive exclusion, and simplification. So how do increasing diversity in ecosystems and increasing complexity in other natural systems relate to progress? The answer is that systems with more complexity, like ecosystems with higher biotic diversity, have a greater resistance to perturbations. They are more stable. As such, they can prosper in tough times, whereas more simplified systems can start to unravel. In an ecosystem with low species richness, the loss of a single species may cascade through the entire ecosystem, disrupting its function. In an ecosystem with high species richness, the probability that the loss of a single species will result in a similar level of disruption is much lower, due to greater repetition in species' ecological roles. Every 4 years, when lemming populations crash in regions of the Arctic, major disruptions move through the Arctic ecosystem. Because this ecosystem has low species richness, the loss of the lemming counts as an enormous loss in prey for predators such as the Arctic fox, snowy owl, and gyrfalcon. As a result, these predator populations crash as well. With reduced predation, the lemming population quickly rebounds, only to suffer another die-off 4 years later. Each time the lemming population peaks, Arctic plants they forage are dramatically reduced, allowing soil nutrients to be leached away at higher rates. This regular, dramatic biological cycle creates an instability in the Arctic ecosystem that is not witnessed in systems with high species richness. In political systems, democracy fosters diversity. In a healthy democracy, that diversity encourages freedom of speech and the press, and a broad range of political views is expressed. This breadth generates social stability through openness and accountability, while allowing the society to develop through the evolution of its values. Workers' rights, women's suffrage, civil rights, and environmental legislation are all examples of the evolution of social values during the 20th century. In contrast, totalitarian states that restrict freedom lack a diversity of views. They represent simple, static systems that can only maintain social stability through brute military might. Compared with democratic societies, totalitarian states have far more frequent upheavals, coups, and military conflicts, making them more unstable political systems. The foundation of sustained progress lies in stable systems that increase diversity through time to resist perturbations. Is this what we see occurring in our national and global economic systems? What is seen in the economic arena is just the opposite, a trend where a diverse array of local and regional commercial enterprises have consistently been replaced by ever larger transnational corporations that increase their size through mergers, acquisitions, and competitive exclusion. A look at the agricultural sector shows this trend quite clearly. Each decade in the United States, the number of farming operations shrinks as more and more of the nation's agricultural production falls in the hands of a decreasing number of agribusinesses that control a constellation of large industrial-strength farms. Between the start of World War II and 2011, the number of farms in the United States steadily dropped from 6.35 million to 2.18 million, while the average size of farms increased from 200 acres to almost 500. Interestingly, Congressionally developed farm subsidies that were intended to shore up small family farms are doing just the opposite. In 2003, 60% of the subsidies went to large agribusinesses that represented only 10% of American farms. Each of these large industrial farms produces a limited number of crops, low diversity, and consumes great quantities of petroleum in the form of pesticides, fertilizers, and diesel fuel to run big farm equipment and grow and transport its products throughout the world. The Institute on Energy and Man, which has tracked global per capita energy consumption and oil production through the last century, shows that global per capita energy consumption peaked in 1979 and has fallen steadily, and has since fallen steadily. The Institute believes that global oil production peaked in 2006 and will fall more than 60% during the next 4 decades. How will these large corporate farms fare in an environment of dwindling oil? Does it make more sense to support systems in which a large array of small, diversified farms can be productive on lower levels of petroleum consumption and can market their products locally rather than needing to truck them across the United States? Every example from the natural world suggests that the move to consolidate farms into larger operations increases the threat of instability. Coupled with global climate change, lack of diversification means that large operations run a higher risk than smaller, diversified farms of being affected by erratic weather events such as drought. Now let's see how consolidation affects the quality of our man-made environment. Imagine you are driving down an urban strip at night on the outskirts of any city in the United States. Could you tell what state you are in? Urban strips have become so homogeneous during the last 30 years that it can be hard to know where we are geographically. All strips will have a handful of similar gas stations, Exxon, Mobil, and Texaco. They share the same fast food restaurants, McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and Kentucky Fried Chicken. And many have the same box stores. Walmart and Home Depot are just 2 examples. Just a few decades ago, regional differences on emerging strips were clearly expressed in the restaurants, clothing, hardware, and other retail stores that were owned and operated by area residents, and they all had a local flair. Those differences have been swallowed up by ever-increasing corporate homogeneity, resulting in dramatic losses of commercial diversity. This loss of commercial diversity has broad implications that go far beyond choices of where to shop. To see the impact of consolidation on commercial enterprise, a look at Walmart is instructive. Walmart is the single largest business in the world today. Its corporate niche is huge, covering the sale of just about any imaginable retail product. It is larger than ExxonMobil, General Motors, and General Electric. It is even larger than its top 5 competitors combined: Target, Sears, JCPenney, Safeway, and Kroger. Out of every consumer dollar spent in the United States during 2002, 7.5 cents went to Walmart. Walmart's hallmark is expressed in its slogan, everyday low prices. No one can sell products for less than Walmart. This is the reason that Walmart has been so successful. But we can never get something for nothing. Low prices come with a number of costs. Since Walmart captured such an important percentage of the retail market, a large constellation of product suppliers has been caught in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. To survive, they need to contract with this retail giant, but contracting with Walmart often generates loss of control over a supplier's business, losses in profits for the supplier, and sometimes even bankruptcy. Walmart can dictate what it is willing to pay for a product and often demands that suppliers sell to Walmart at a price lower than what they agreed to the previous year. As a result, suppliers have to find ways to manage on lower profits. If they don't, they may be dropped by the chain. In the case of an umbrella supplier that asked for a 5% price increase on its product, a Walmart representative said, quote, "We were expecting a 5% decrease. We're off by 10%. Go back and sharpen your pencil, unquote. The umbrella supplier reworked the numbers and returned with a request for a 2% increase. Walmart's reply was, "We'll go with a Chinese manufacturer." The umbrella supplier was dropped. A common way for suppliers to stay with Walmart is to cut costs through outsourcing. sending manufacturing outside the United States to places like China or Mexico. Garment workers in China make less than 20 cents an hour, a rate that is impossible to match for American workers. In 2004, Levi Strauss, in its attempt to survive as a business and supply Walmart with an inexpensive line of jeans, closed its last U.S. factories, laying off 2,500 workers. Just 2 decades earlier, it had had 60 plants operating in the United States. Cutting employee benefits is another way to cut costs, and suppliers aren't the only ones that cut benefits for their workers. In 2002, only 38% of Walmart's employees had health coverage, meaning that the largest corporation in the world doesn't offer health plans or retirement benefits to the majority of its workers, a state of affairs that affects more than Walmart employees. Responding to criticism, Walmart did increase its health coverage to workers up to 52% of its workforce by 2009. However, in the fall of 2011, Walmart cut health care benefits for employees working less than 24 hours per week and removed coverage for spouses for employees working between 24 hours and 33 hours per week. At the time, Walmart declined to specify what percentage of its workforce was affected by those cuts. One reason health insurance rates continue to increase so dramatically in the United States is that a large percentage of working families don't have health care coverage. In 2005, 3 of the largest supermarket chains in the United States, Safeway, Kroger, and Albertsons, settled a 5-month strike with California workers. The deal keeps current workers' wages and health benefits in place, but dramatically reduces both for new hires. The chains want to cut labor costs by $1 billion to remain competitive with Walmart. When we examine the trend in health care benefits provided by private industry, we see a drop from 97% supplying health care benefits in 1980 to 73% in 2005. I can imagine that most people would not see this as a sign of progress. Low prices at Walmart drive quality manufacturing jobs out of the United States, increasing job insecurity in this country, force reductions in employee benefits and wages, and increase pollution and other environmental problems associated with manufacturing goods in less environmentally regulated countries, such as Mexico and China. Walmart's low prices have definite costs that are borne by all of us. Regarding consumer prices, Steve Dobbins, president of Carolina Mills, states, quote, "We want clean air, clean water, good living conditions, the best health care in the world, yet we aren't willing to pay for anything manufactured under those conditions," unquote. Decreasing prices of consumer products are used as an indicator of progress. But are losses in job security, job quality, employee benefits, wages, and environmental protection signs of progress? These are costs that as a society we all pay, and they have big impacts on the quality of life for many Americans. One result of the outsourcing of jobs is that the labor market becomes increasingly unstable. In my parents' generation, many individuals spent their entire working careers with a single organization. There was a higher degree of loyalty between workers and the businesses employing them than we see today, creating job stability that was translated into stable family economies. Today, the average employee's tenure with an organization hovers at 3.6 years. We see that with increasing competitive exclusion in business, resulting in homogenization and simplification of the economic sector, comes increasing instability in jobs and families. Experts tell us that this is just a short-term trend in globalization and that more and better jobs are on their way. Such statements are based on an inherent belief in an ideology of free trade and open markets. Although free trade and open markets are great for corporations, the reality for the majority of individuals and families is that access to quality jobs and employment security have decreased steadily for decades. Why shouldn't we imagine that the new quality jobs brought on by globalization will simply be outsourced, just as the jobs in the information technology sector are? Another area where we have witnessed increasing consolidation is in the media. This trend is a threat to a healthy democracy because it decreases the scope of views to which citizens are exposed. In his book, The Media Monopoly, Ben Badikayan was labeled an alarmist for pointing out that 50 corporations controlled the U.S. news media in 1983. An update of his book in 1992 highlighted that 90% of the mass media, including the news, was controlled by fewer than 24 corporate giants. He went on to predict that it wouldn't be long before this number decreased to half a dozen, where it did in the year 2000. Not only have we seen consolidation of media giants, AOL, Time Warner, Disney, and Viacom, but major television news outlets are owned by huge corporations. For instance, NBC is owned by General Electric. As more and more of the news we read, see, and hear is produced by fewer and larger for-profit corporations, the depth and diversity of views is reduced greatly to increase profits and reinforce corporate interests. As Lowry Mays, CEO of Clear Channel, which owns 1,200 radio stations nationwide, once stated, quote, "We're not in the business of providing news or information. We're not in the business of providing well-researched music. We're in the business of selling our customers' products," unquote. When such a large component of public opinion is formulated through a handful of radio and TV networks, these trends are clearly counterproductive to supporting a vigorous democracy. What then are we to make of the 2004 ruling by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to loosen regulations to allow further corporate consolidation of the airwaves? By a 3-2 vote, the FCC increased the ceiling for ownership of television stations from 35% of the national audience to 45% and lifted a ban that prevented media companies from owning both newspapers and television or radio outlets. Not only that, but FCC Chairman Michael Powell refused to hold more than one meeting for public comment. Luckily, because of public outcry, Congress stepped in and overturned the FCC's ruling. If the charge of the FCC is to oversee the use of the airwaves for the public good, why would the agency rush to push through a ruling to consolidate media clout, while at the same time seriously limiting public comment? The answer lies in a trend that has increased corporate power and political influence since prior to the Civil War. The rise of corporate power. When the United States was founded, the government exerted strong controls over corporate activities as a means to maintain a vibrant democracy. For example, corporations could be founded to engage in public works projects like building a canal. But once the project was completed and the investors had received a decent profit, ownership of the project reverted to the government. Corporations were also excluded from the political process. But through the mid-1800s, corporate power grew with increasing industrialization and began to influence the political process to its own advantage, eventually resulting in a landmark Supreme Court case in 1886. In Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, the court ruled in favor of the railroad. Many people believe that the court decision gave the railroad and all future corporations the rights of persons and, as such, coverage by the Bill of Rights. But the notion of corporations as persons was not actually in the court's decision. It was added by the court reporter who wrote the introduction, called a headnote to the decision. Although headnotes have no legal standing, the right of personhood for corporations has been accepted by the Supreme Court since 1886. Included in these rights is freedom of political speech. The Supreme Court later expanded corporate political free speech in the 1970s, supporting corporations' ability to contribute to political campaigns. Finally, in 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United that corporate funding of political positions in campaigns could not be limited, as doing so would infringe on the right to free speech. Now corporations can spend as much money as they wish to influence the outcome of an election so that policies favorable to them can be legislated. It would not be amiss to say that the democracy envisioned by the founders of this country has now become a corpocracy. The court's interpretation of the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause has also been quite favorable to corporate interests. This clause was originally developed to keep states from obstructing the movement of goods or people across state boundaries. However, corporate-friendly interpretations now allow corporations to challenge most state laws regulating activities within their borders. In Vermont, where the agricultural economy largely rests in small family-owned dairy farms, there was a lot of concern in the early 1990s about the use of bovine growth hormone, BGH, to boost milk production in cows. The concern was threefold. Worries about synthetic hormones entering the food supply through milk products, fears that in a BGH market environment, small Vermont farms would become less competitive than big Western dairies, and concern for the well-being of dairy cows, who have decreased life expectancy when treated with BGH. These concerns soon were mobilized into a grassroots citizens' effort advocating a state law that would require all milk products produced with BGH to be labeled so consumers could decide whether or not they wished to buy these products. The bill passed the Vermont legislature in 1994 and was quickly in the courts. The federal court overturned the law in 1996 because it violated a corporate's right of free speech. In this case, the right in question was actually a right not to speak in order to withhold information from citizens. That corporations can quash a state's sovereign right to enact legislation that allows its citizens to be better informed is a scary prospect for democracy. But the Vermont example is just the tip of the iceberg in corporate rule over the sovereign rights of peoples and elected governments. In 1999, the world got its first glimpse of mass demonstrations against economic globalization as protesters attempted to close down a meeting of the World Trade Organization, WTO, in Seattle. The media generally portrayed the protesters as part of a misguided fringe movement and globalization as a necessary good. What the media coverage failed to show was that the protesters weren't against global trade. Rather, they were protesting current trade agreements that gave corporations power over sovereign governments and peoples, and as such allowed corporations to trump many social and environmental laws developed by democratic institutions, stating that these laws were barriers to free trade. Under the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, any corporation can sue a government directly for what it sees as a barrier to free trade. During the spring of 2004, a secret tribunal of the WTO was examining a case brought against the United States by the Canadian corporation Methanex, which produces a gasoline additive, MTBE. MTBE has been shown to be a neurotoxin that can be inhaled with gasoline fumes and has a high propensity to contaminate groundwater. To protect public health, California banned MTBE as a gasoline additive. Methanex maintained that the California law acted as a barrier to trade and sued for $970 million. The tribunal eventually threw out Methanex's suit, although this was a victory for human safety. If the ruling had gone the other way, there would be no way to avoid the financial penalty American taxpayers would be forced to pay. The General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, goes even further. While other trade agreements deal in the free trade of goods, GATS deals in open markets for services, even services regarding public health. Any regulatory laws, such as health and safety, discrimination, or setting pollution standards, that can be seen as blocking access to service markets can be grounds for suing a nation. In this way, the sovereignty of governments and peoples to look out for their own physical well-being becomes subservient to corporate interests. To the protesters in Seattle and other cities, the issue wasn't global trade, but the usurpation of sovereignty and democracy. The demands of the protesters for fair trade where democratic rights are honored, rather than free trade that usurps them, shows that these concerned citizens are not against trade itself, but how it is conducted. Currently, the relationship between the people and the economy has been turned on its head. An economy is supposed to serve its people. However, in the world today, people are to serve the economy. This may be why our leaders often refer to us as consumers rather than citizens. Not only do individual corporations continue to grow, simplifying the economic system, but political power has been concentrated in transnational corporations to such a degree that democracy itself is being undermined. All international trade agreements thus far have been crafted behind closed doors with no accountability to the public by appointed officials. The diversity of opinions, social structures, approaches to governance, and cultural traditions around the world are being compromised as transnational corporations consolidate and increase their hold on power. What is being created is a homogeneous global economy that becomes less accountable to people and less able to resist disruption. In terms of this last point, Hurricane Katrina exposed the soft underbelly of this system and its inherent fragility. As we saw above, within self-organized, complex systems, repetition of function is a common attribute. In Vermont, if we lose one of our insect pollinators, we will have many other species that will service our flowering plants. People with brain injuries who lose their ability to speak often find that speech returns as other parts of the brain take on that function. These are both examples of redundancy in complex systems. What Hurricane Katrina exposed was the fragility of our oil supply system. One storm generated a 40% spike in the cost of gasoline almost overnight. Part of this may have been related to price gouging, but a good part of it was related to the fact that a majority of our petroleum refining capacity lay within Katrina's storm track. This is clear evidence of a simplified system that has little repetition and, as a result, little stability. Just as the notion that ever-increasing growth will generate further progress has no scientific grounding, our current global economic system is behaving in a way that is absolutely contradictory to the way all natural complex systems function. I'm going to say that again. Just as the notion that ever-increasing growth will generate further progress has no scientific grounding, our current global economic system is behaving in a way that is absolutely contradictory to the way all natural complex systems function. Whereas natural systems grow more diverse, integrated, and energy efficient, with each specialized part working to support the other parts in a stable system, our global economic system is moving in the opposite direction. It is moving toward simplification and homogeneity through competitive exclusion, wasteful use of resources, and lack of integration, with each corporate entity looking out for its own interests, profits, rather than the well-being of the whole. The self-organized economy, the scientific rationale for relocalization. The principle of self-organization is apparent not only in ecosystems and the human body, but also in successful non-living human systems, such as an economy. 2 centuries before Western science recognized this principle, Adam Smith articulated how self-organization occurs through the invisible hand, quote-unquote, of the marketplace. In his 1776 classic, The Wealth of Nations, the kind of economic system Smith wrote about was a village economy with specialized merchants, butchers, bakers, blacksmiths, brewers. Being specialized, the merchants were not in competition with one another and were tightly integrated. Each did what he did for reasons of self-interest and at the same time provided services that supported one another without anyone directing the interrelationships. That was Smith's invisible hand. The blacksmith made knives that he sold to the butcher. The butcher in turn used those knives in his business and sold meat to the blacksmith. For more than a century, our economic system has consistently moved away from the type of self-organization Smith described. Corporations have grown into huge transnational giants that are no longer specialists integrated with others in their sector, but generalists that work to monopolize many sectors through competitive exclusion, mergers, and acquisitions. As a result, the economy has lost repetition of function and resiliency. A look at any sector of the United States economy, finance, energy, agriculture, retail, media, will show that a large proportion of capital is concentrated in just a handful of extremely large corporations that have little interest in integrating with others in their sector as they strive for dominance. The critical reason for the collapse of the financial sector during the fall of 2008 was not risky investments, those were the catalysts, but the fact that the sector totally lacked self-organization. At that time, over 50% of all bank assets in the United States were held in just 10 gargantuan banks. These firms were not specialists and were all invested in the same kinds of instruments. As soon as Lehman Brothers started to falter, the whole sector, and the global economy as well, would have toppled in a chain reaction if the U.S. government hadn't stepped in. If the United States had had hundreds or more moderate-sized specialized banks in 2008, in place of 10 huge ones, the financial system would have been just fine. Those making risky investments would have failed, and there would have been hundreds of other banks remaining solvent, keeping the financial system viable. An ironic outcome of the 2008 collapse is that 77% of all the bank assets in the United States were held in the top 10 banks by 2011, making the financial system even less resilient than it had been just a few years earlier. Given the political realities we face today, I have little faith that the federal government will be able to do anything significant to create a more resilient economy. I also believe that if things continue as they are at present, a future economic meltdown is very likely, the next one potentially being far worse than 2008. If we wish to have a resilient and stable future, our only choice is for citizens and municipalities at the local and regional level to recreate them. This will mean investing in smaller, specialized enterprises that can integrate in supportive ways with others in their sector, as Smith described in the 18th century. The support for these businesses will come from individuals making the conscious choice to patronize them rather than the large corporate giants, and municipalities and states creating policies that are friendlier to smaller, specialized enterprises. This process is already taking place in my region of New England, particularly within our regional food system. When my wife Marcia and I first moved to Putney, Vermont in 1976, there was just one food co-op, one farmer's market, and no community-supported agriculture, CSA, farms in the entire region. Today, we have 5 regional food co-ops, over half a dozen farmers markets, and various CSAs too numerous to count. Among the blossoming of regional agricultural enterprises, a number of the CSAs are linking up and working together. Rather than competing, some local vegetable growers are intentionally growing different crops and then combining their product into a single CSA. Others are bringing in organic dairies, meat providers, and bakers to create CSAs that supply just about all their clients' needs. Also, waste products from one farm become valuable resources to another farm. The food system in the lower Connecticut River Valley of Vermont and New Hampshire is now maturing to the point where municipalities are trying to attract food processors to create a regional, year-round food supply. Just a little over a decade ago, agriculture in the region was a declining economic proposition. Now it is becoming an important component of a resurgent economy. The effort to create a more resilient economy is also taking hold in other sectors. Our small regional banks and credit unions have seen a significant increase in new customers as people consciously make decisions to pull their finances out of the hands of large banks in favor of their local and regional institutions. The investments in big banks that used to support large corporations now are shifting to support local businesses, fostering greater self-organization. I am confident that we will see investment in local and regional enterprises continue to rise. These changes are analogous to coevolution in ecosystems. Like energy, capital will flow through more and more specialized integrated businesses, creating a resilient and stable economy. One, I might add, that will be far more environmentally friendly and socially just than our current economic system, thanks to greater energy efficiency and transparency. Smaller businesses cannot afford to mechanize on the scale of large companies, and as a result, they use lower amounts of energy and material resources. In our current economic system, efficiency is measured by the amount of output that can be produced per number of employees. High levels of mechanization, such as robotics used in assembly lines or huge harvesters used on industrial farms, make a business more efficient, as they dramatically lower labor and its associated costs. The problem, from an environmental standpoint, is that mechanization also dramatically increases the material and energy use in production, generating higher levels of entropy. Also, smaller businesses have more regional markets, decreasing the energy used in transporting their products. Together, these make smaller economic entities more energy and materially efficient. At the same time, their practices are more transparent to the public. If they are engaged in activities that are socially unjust, or create local environmental problems, for example, people will know and may then decide not to support the companies that are problematic. By contrast, many, even most, of the practices of transnational corporations are not visible to the people who consume their products. Life has cloaked this planet for at least 3.8 billion years, and during that time, not only has it sustained itself, it has thrived. This enormous length of time is a little easier to comprehend using an analogy of a stack of paper. Imagine that the thickness of a standard sheet of paper equals a century. 2 sheets would represent the tenure of industrial civilization. 200 sheets, or 1-inch thick stack of paper, would represent the time it is believed that humans have lived in the Americas. How tall would the stack need to be to represent the tenure of life on Earth? It would be over 3 miles in height, each sheet representing 100 years. Which model would you bet on for long-term sustainability? The model life on Earth presents through co-evolved specialization, integration, repetition of function, and efficiency, or our present corporate model, which has functioned for a little more than a century through competitive exclusion and energy inefficiency. Self-organization is a model to which we need to pay close attention, and one we should consciously weave into our local and regional economies.